And you are very likely saying to yourself, that doesn't look like the ASDM to me. That looks like a command line. Well, we had a little sad occurrence since the last video, and I apologize for the delay in videos being posted here for those of you who are following along as I create the course. One of those sad things, unfortunately, our ASA died. So we need a moment of silence for that. And usually, of course, I have plenty of hardware backups for everything we have here. I think I have at least 2 of everything they've ever made sometimes in the server room. But we did have to wait on a new ASA, which we're going to take that negative, that time delay, and make it into a positive because I really haven't configured much of anything on this ASA. We just took it out of the box, hooked it up, and it's ready to go. Or is it? I want to show you one odd little default, something you should be aware of, more for the real world than for your exam. And we'll take a look at the startup config, the default configuration as well, and do a little bit of work here at the command line. Again, for your exam, you're usually going to be using the ASDM, and that's why we stay with it so much in this particular course. But it never hurts to see what's going on at the command line, and I especially want to show you an interesting default or two here on the ASA. The first one being that we, of course, are not in any kind of enable mode or anything like that. We can't really configure anything from here, and the default name, as you see, is Cisco ASA. So the natural thing we would do is to try to get into enable mode, and we're prompted for a password, which is interesting because this is straight out of the box and I haven't configured a password. And those of you who took the CCNA course with me, of course, you're thinking, well, the first thing he mentions about passwords is there are no default passwords. You get a Cisco router, there's no password on the enable port or the VTY lines. You get a Cisco switch, there's no default password anywhere. So what do you think this default password is? What would be a logical guess? It is nothing fancy, I assure you. Well, we could try Cisco, and also note that we actually get asterisks here on the ASA when we type in characters. It's not that. We could try password, or another awful password, which is QWERTY, and nothing. And the usual applies here as far as the number of attempts, 3 attempts, and that's it. But we didn't get locked out or anything like that. So I could just keep trying. Maybe it's enable. Maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, so none of the usual bad passwords apply. So, you get a brand new piece of equipment, you're ready to go, and, maybe you thump the keyboard on the right side out of frustration a little bit, or somehow hit the enter key, and you realize that while you will be prompted for a password by default, the password is basically just hit the enter key at the ASA. That's all you got to do. Now, of course, you can go in and set one, which would be a good idea. But that is the default. Definitely wanted to share that with you and share to you a little bit of real-world frustration. Let's quickly do a show run here. And something I want to mention here as we take a look at a default config here is that as you work more with the ASA at the command line, it's really going to come to you that you're not dealing with a router. Some of the commands between Cisco routers and the ASA are the same, but most of them, frankly, are different. And since we stay with the GUI so much, I want to show you 1 or 2 commands here, see if there's anything fancy about putting an IP address on an interface. And we're going to have to do that here in a moment because, as you see, our 3 interfaces here, the first 3 we're looking at, and the 3 that we're going to use in the lab. I know that I haven't shown you the diagram for the lab yet. I will do that at the beginning of the next video, but I wanted to dive in the command line with you here first. And it's interesting that here by default, gig 1 has the name set to outside, and that is the command for setting an interface as your inside interface, your outside interface, or your DMZ, and that is the name if command. So we'll use that here in a moment, but you can see that gig 1 is already set to outside, gig 2 is already set to inside, and notice the security levels. They are what we would expect. Outside is set to 0 and the inside interface set to a security level of 100. So those are good command line commands to know as well. And note that gig 2 has an IP address pre-configured, which is very unusual. That's certainly changeable. We're going to keep it for our lab. But again, that's the one default IP address that we see. We see an inside and outside interface defined. And also notice that we have both of those are shut down. So we're going to need to open those before we get to work in the lab. Now, gig 1.3, we're going to come back to that. because again, while we're not locked in on which interface has to be outside or inside or the DMZ, because of course you may not even have a DMZ, that's not a requirement, but in our lab we're definitely going to have one and check a little connectivity. And we're going to put that on gig 1.3. We're going to come back to that, but let's just look through the rest of the config. And as you can see, the interfaces that you would expect, there is also a management port. And I will swing back up just a little bit and show you that, we're looking at 5, 6, 7, 8 here, and that's about it. But we do have this management interface. And let's see, a lot of commands here, anything particular jumping out. We see the MTU set to 1500 for inside and outside interfaces. Let's go ahead now. We're going to end up looking through a policy here. You can see there's a default policy pre-configured on here as you'd expect, and then a global policy. And all kinds of inspections going on, and then that's about it. And of course, as this keeps going, it's the config will get longer. I also want to describe to you what you see here at the end, because it's very unusual to actually see a URL in a default config. And notice its destination address and profile Cisco TAC. This is Call Home Reporting Anonymous. It's one of these things that lets them collect anonymous statistics from your device if you choose to. And when I booted up, I did go ahead and say no. But you can also change that if you want to be part of that program and just enter Call Home Reporting Anonymous as a global config command. Just take the no out of the front of it, that is, and you'll be all set. But I just wanted to describe to you what that is, because again, you usually don't see a URL set. So let's go ahead and configure interface 3, gig 3, as our DMZ, and see if we run into any odd commands. And we're going to start with the name if command, and you see that's unrecognized because I am not at the interface level. And you can see word less than 49 characters, the name by which this interface will be referred to, and all other commands. I know a little of that's cut off, but I don't want to make the font that small. So let's say that I call it DMZ. And notice it said security level for DMZ set to 0 by default. You will see that set to 0 by default unless you specify inside. And then inside's going to zip up to 100. So what do we want to do as far as the security level here? Do we really want it to be the same as the outside interface? No, we don't want that. We're going to go ahead and set that to 50. And let's do a security level 50. And then that's it. And I'm going to go ahead and give it its IP address now. And again, I know I haven't shared the lab topology with you, but we'll have that at the beginning of the next video. And what else do I need here? Absolutely, for anything to start working. The DMZ is set to 50. We configure that with security level. We need to do a no shut. And let's go ahead and run a show interface gig 1.3. And we see, holy cow, as we zoom by it, there's a little more information here than we're used to seeing on a router, and you see it at the very bottom now, traffic statistics for DMZ, but you also see that we're auto duplex, auto speed, pretty much what you would expect to see on an interface. Let's go down there, and 3 packets input, 1 packets output, 3 packets dropped, and of course that will continue to increment as time goes on and we finish the configuration, because actually we still need to configure a host there. And really, that's it. Again, I just want to remind you, and show route is a good idea, because when you run show IP route and you want to start checking configurations at the command line and checking your routing table on an ASA, you are probably going to run show IP route a couple of times because you've been running it ever since you started studying Cisco technologies. You've been running show IP route. This is just one of the things you have to get used to at the command line. I mentioned it before, and I'll mention it here again. There's a learning curve there and a little frustration level. I've been there with you. And again, most of the time we're going to be in the ASDM, but here at the command line, you just have to get used to the fact that you're kind of speaking another language. And what you're going to do is run show route here instead of show IP route. And you can see we have the connected and the local routes as you would expect with that particular interface. We will see others open up as I open gig 1 and gig 2. I'll do that at the beginning of the next video because we need to give the outside interface an IP address. We'll check a little connectivity and see if our DMZ to outside rules hold up. So when you come back, we'll take a look at the lab topology that we're going to have in place, and we'll send some pings around and have a look at the ASDM. I promise this time. I'll see you on the next vid.